Well, I will begin by saying welcome to everybody, and we're so happy that you can join us for our October program meeting, which is going to be a fun and interesting journey for a location that's not that far away and is quite accessible for people to travel to. So I've been there. We took my mother there, 15 years ago, I think, and 20 years ago, probably. And it was a wonderful geological experience, and she enjoyed geology. And of course, we all birded and looked at everything we could find and explored the whole area. So I'm excited to hear Gina's presentation tonight. And we do want to welcome new folks and folks who've been with us before. This Zoom program format is working well in lieu of being able to meet you all in person in the good old days, which we used to do. And interestingly, I thought people might want to know, last month when we had an in-person and a Zoom program, the hybrid version with Noah Stricker, there were 30 people in the Willamette 100 Hall, which holds over 100 people. And then there were about 111 computers Zooming in. So that was a pretty telling number, in that I think most people are still actually pretty comfortable doing the Zoom from the comfort of their home. And even though it was great to see Noah in person and be there, I had a little anxiety about going into a meeting hall, and frankly, somewhat worried about too many people showing up. So it was interesting, though, to find out how that would play out. So I just thought some of you might be interested in that. We had done a survey at the end of last year asking how many people would want to do an in-person meeting, and it was about 50-50 versus Zooming or in-person. And so I think folks are still pretty comfortable doing the Zoom for now, and the numbers keep piling in. And then we have 55 computers right now. So I just wanted to say welcome and give you a little bit of feedback about how that's going. And we will be Zooming more throughout the rest of our programs coming up. That we don't have an alternative plan right now. I think Dennis can fill you in more about that. So I can pass things over to Debbie if she has any more announcements for you.
So yeah, just real quick, we wanted to invite everybody to check out our new refurbished, updated website. So please log in. It's real pretty. Wanted to remind everybody to save the date. Those of you who are interested in knowing about the Christmas bird count, there will be lots of information coming up next month and in December, but just for those who want to save the date, it will be January 2nd of next year. And my quick conservation reminder is that winter's coming, and for those of us who are lucky enough to have gardens, there are things that we can do in the garden to help birds through the winter and get them ready for next spring. Again, I'm reminding you to keep your gardens messy. Anything lying around in the garden, leaves, twigs, flower heads, brush piles, they all provide shelter and food for birds, as well as for the bugs that many birds rely on. Please leave some bare, undisturbed soil and pithy stems around your garden for native pollinators. That's where many of them overwinter. It's a really good time to plant because nature will water your plants for you through the season, and they'll be ready for you in the spring. When you do consider planting, this is a good time. Please plant native plants. They're less expensive for you to maintain. They grow better because they've evolved to do well in this climate, and they work with the birds who live here and the pollinators. And just a reminder to keep your gardens as friendly as you can for birds. Try not to spray chemicals or use pelleticides, weed and feed, or moss killer. Those are all toxic in some ways to either the birds or the foods that they rely on. So just a reminder, stay messy in the garden and you will be helping birds through the winter. Unfortunately, I was not invited onto SpaceX, so that's not actually the Earth behind me. It's just a picture, but I feel like all of us living on Earth here can do our little bit of parts in our little bit of space and make it a little bit of a friendlier place for the birds and the bees. And I'm going to turn it over to Dennis.
Okay, I want to let you know about what's coming up. Next month, we're going to have Ron Papish. A lot of you know him. This will be his 4th program with us. He originally was going to do a program about Brazil, but his trip was canceled there. And so he decided to go to Alaska. And those of you who know Ram, he's always got amazing stories and fantastic photography. So we're really looking forward to his program about bear necessities. And this is going to be about, obviously the big brown bears up in Alaska. So it should be a lot of fun. Look forward to that. That'll be next month, November 23. Tonight, I want to tell you a little bit about our speaker. Gina Roberti grew up in Rhode Island. She was studying at Brown University, where she got her degree in geology and biology. And she moved out west here because of her excitement about some rocks that she found in the Siskiyou Mountains in southern Oregon. So she was drawn out here by some local rocks. Anyway, because she's a geologist, you'd think she's just looking at the ground all the time, but she's not. She's interested in birds too. And she ended up at Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument. And we're real excited to have her because she's going to tell us about some of those amazing birds that are found in that amazing mountain that we all know about. And a lot of us were here when it blew up. And so we're real excited to have her. So Gina, why don't you take over?
Thank you, Dennis, for that wonderful introduction. Hello, everyone. It is a lovely opportunity to be part of your program. I'm going to just give a quick perspective on myself and the perspectives that I'm sharing this evening. My training is in Western science, and that is likely the training that we all have received, but that is just one perspective in many different ways of knowing the world. So there's other ways, indigenous ways of knowing, and other ways of interacting with the natural world. And what I'm going to speak to this evening is the training that I've received through my degree in geology, my experience teaching and working at Mount St. Helens, and teaching about the Western science practices that occur there, as well as from the birding community that's rooted in Western science. I'm going to begin by sharing my screen here. And we'll get this slideshow started. So the presentation this evening is titled Observation Point. And I'm going to focus on birding in the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument. Now, I chose this photograph for the opening photo and background photo because it speaks to many things that I will be speaking about this evening. Specifically, there's a spot of life in a landscape that's otherwise many people think of as a volcanic debris wasteland. This hummingbird here is pollinating some of the paintbrush, some of the earlier low flowering plants to return to the landscape. And I'm going to speak a lot about the renewal of life at Mount St. Helens, what happened during this eruption, and how the birds play a very big role in both the renewal and have responded to the way that the landscape has changed. So again, this is a bit about me. I currently work for a nonprofit called the Mount St. Helens Institute. My professional degrees are from Brown University and Western Washington University, and I consider myself a naturalist. So I speak from a perspective that's not solely focused on birds, but is more well-rounded. And today we're going to focus primarily on habitat. And then I'm hoping to give you all the tools so that you can identify the habitat and go out to find the birds that you want to seek in some of these habitats. The photograph here is on the north side of Mount St. Helens on this area called the Singe Zone. I'll review that this evening, but you can see some of the standing dead trees behind me offer a really wonderful habitat for birds who return to the area after the eruption of Mount St. Helens. A couple of guidelines to review this evening. Please keep your microphones muted to prevent distracting background noise. You're welcome to turn on or off your video, but everyone can see primarily my video screen, so no one is watching you, don't worry. Throughout the presentation, you are welcome to share your ideas in the chat. I know some of you are comfortable using the chat feature and some of you are not. It's just a participatory tool, so please feel welcome to write notes and responses, observations, and questions in the chat. And then some of our hosts here will feed me some of the questions if they come up in the chat, if you don't want to unmute yourself and speak out loud. Finally, if you do have a question or like to make a comment, you're welcome to write it into the chat. I will have a couple of opportunities throughout the presentation for questions, but we're primarily going to hold the Q&A session until the end of the presentation. Today, I'd like to cover 3 different topics, and I've structured it around these 3 questions. The first question is, what distinct habitat zones were created by the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens? Secondly, what makes Mount St. Helens a unique place to visit for birding? And then what are the best ways to visit Mount St. Helens for birding? I'm going to start by setting some context for place. So here's a map of North America, and I'm going to zoom in on this map. This is an interactive map, and I took some screenshot stills of this, but this is a project called Native Land. And what this map does is it superimposes on our familiar landscape of North America different colors. Each of these different colors are representing a different community of indigenous people that have called this land home. And you can see, and where we live, there are many different overlapping colors. And if we zoom on in, this map also contains different colors that show the different languages that are spoken in different regions. And if I zoom into where we are in the Pacific Northwest, you might be familiar with some of these names. Up by Seattle, you can see the Samish, Coast Salish, Tulalip, Skykomish, Muckleshoot, Nisqually, and down where we are, Malala, and some of the tribes that are in the Willamette Valley. And if we zoom into where the volcano Mount St. Helens is, we can see there are overlapping colors of people, indigenous communities that call this land home. And these people include the Cowlitz. I don't know how to pronounce this, as their a different way of saying their tribal name. And these people have different names for Mount St. Helens. So some of these names, for example, the Cowlitz people have La Wet Lakla, meaning the smoking being or smoking one, this personified view of a mountain emitting smoke. An Upper Chehalis name for Mount St. Helens, which is, I don't know how to pronounce this, I've never been told how to pronounce this name, but can translate loosely into water coming out, referring to some of the steam and some of the eruptions. And then a Upper Chinooka name for Snow Mountain. And these are 2 photographs showing the volcano Mount St. Helens before the big eruption in 1980. And what's unique and fun about Mount St. Helens is because it is the youngest volcano in the modern High Cascades range, its entire eruptive history that is built up the cone that you can see in this photograph here has been witnessed by people. Considering the cone itself is only about 4,000 years old, geologically speaking, so there have been people who have witnessed every eruption that Mount St. Helens, the volcano, has had. Usually, often I think about volcanoes as being older than people, but this is one case where the human communities in relationship to the lands are older than the volcano itself. Now, I do want to speak to the history of the indigenous communities in this place, because as birders, we are going to the land that now is available for us to travel to, but in many cases that land was taken away without consent from the people, the indigenous people who call that place home and still call those places home. And I just want to show a map of the distribution of where present day reservations are in Washington State. In Washington State, there are 29 federally recognized tribal nations. And it's important for me to speak about this at the beginning of our presentation, because we all, again, are visiting land that has a complex history. And one of the first steps to reconciling with that history is to understand and to learn about what history actually happens. And we can see some of these tall snow-covered volcanoes in the center of the Cascades Range. Mount St. Helens is over down where it says Cowlitz. And you can see the Cowlitz have one tiny small little piece of reservation down there. But where the volcano actually is, there's no reservation lands. So the Pacific Northwest is home to many communities of people since time immemorial. That's a phrase that's used to say that people have lived here since before the time of human memory. And these people have a long tradition of understanding the volcanoes in this place. Now, what's unique about Mount St. Helens is that after the volcano erupted, it was put aside as a national volcanic monument, but also it was set aside as a traditional cultural property. And this is a unique designation. Many people are not necessarily familiar with this. What this means is that our federal government recognizes Mount St. Helens as a significant place for the indigenous people, the Cowlitz, and Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation. For those people, this is considered a special place, and it is put on the National Park Service's National Register of Historic Places. But what it really means at Mount St. Helens is that in a mountain landscape, which is managed by the U.S. Forest Service, the tribal indigenous people have a say in some of the management. So everything above tree line on the volcano is co-managed by both the federal agency and the tribes. And this affects many things. This affects how much monitoring equipment, scientific equipment can go up, whether that's equipment monitoring birds or monitoring the volcano, volcanic activity itself. It also affects how many people get to climb to the top. So if you really want to capture your lifer of a certain bird at the summit of Mount St. Helens, well, the tribe plays a role in deciding how many people get to actually go above tree line. And this designation happened in let's see, I don't even know if the date is on here. I think it was in 2001, perhaps, maybe a little bit earlier. And I just want to quote the chairman of the Cowlitz Indian tribe, Bill Ayel, who is the former chairman now. He said, quote, "The listing of Lawet Lakla, or Mount St. Helens, as a traditional cultural property honors the long relationship between the Cowlitz people and one of the principal features of our traditional landscape. For millennia, the mountain has been a place where tribal members went to seek spiritual guidance. She has erupted many times in our memory, but each time has rebuilt herself anew. She demonstrates that a slow and patient path of restoration is a successful one." And I just love this positive view on a place that was non-consensually taken from the Cowlitz people. We're going to have a little fun during this presentation. I've embedded 5 different polls here in Zoom. And what's going to happen is you are going to get a question that's going to pop up on your screen. So we'll launch this poll. And this is, I want to understand for the people that are here live today, what is your relationship to the May 18th, 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens? We're going to zoom on to this big eruption. And some of the options are I could see or hear the eruption for where I was living or traveling. Perhaps you might have witnessed volcanic ash falling in your community. Perhaps you remember it being reported on the news. Perhaps you were not alive when the volcano erupted. And we'll give about just 1 more minute for this poll here. Really high participation, everyone, 90% participation in this group. This is wonderful. I'm going to end the poll and we're going to see what people said. So you should be able to see the results in your screen. Could I get verbal confirmation for someone that you can see the results?
We see it.
Okay, great. So it looks like many people, the majority of people, remember reporting about the eruption on the news. Some people experience ash falling in their community, maybe from the May 18th eruption or successive later eruptions. And some people actually could see or hear the eruption from where they were living. If anyone would like to share more notes about your personal experience, you are welcome to write your feedback into the chat. We can review at the end. Thank you all for participating. I'm going to bring us to just look at this beautiful painting here. It's a painting that was on display at the Portland Art Museum recently in their volcano exhibit. Sadly, it is down, but I've provided a link to the exhibit, which was created, like an online version of it was created. And this is a painting by Hank Pender of a later eruption, not the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. I think it's 1982, but a view looking north from Portland. And I just love the accoutrement of binoculars and the radio and looking at one person's perspective of this volcano erupting. So we're going to focus on Mount St. Helens, and we're going to just do a classic review of what happened during this big explosive eruption that occurred at the volcano in 1980. So here's a beautiful pre-1980 eruption photo. Notice there are some houses along the lake there. There were vacation homes and a Boy Scout camp. And many of the Western settlers who lived in the flanks of Mount St. Helens did not consider the volcano a volcano, but just called it a mountain. And so when it did start rumbling and an eruption did happen, it was somewhat of a surprise to people because this was not in their institutional memory, the fact that this volcano, was a smoking being, as the Cowlitz referred to it as. Here's a photograph showing from almost the same perspective how the landscape changed after the eruption. You're welcome to type in the chat if you observe anything in these photographs, any differences. Something that I noticed, primarily we're thinking about birds, so I'm thinking about habitat. And I'm seeing deep dark green, well-developed old growth forest. And then that forest is gone in the second photo. Now here's a couple of images showing exactly what happened during the big eruption. There was a photographer out on the north side of Mount St. Helens, and by a trick of luck, it's an amazing story. You can actually read his first person narrative of this. He just nudged his tripod. He was photographing the mountain on the morning of May 18th, 1980. It was a sunny, clear, beautiful day. And he just happened to nudge his tripod over, and it centered not the mountain, but the successive explosion and blast that happened. Now just think about if he had nudged his tripod in the opposite direction, we wouldn't have been able to get such data off of these photographs. In fact, scientists use these photographs, this series, we'll play it one more time, to calculate just how much material came out during the eruption, how fast material was moving. It's very important data in the form of these photographs. They're also very famous photographs. And we can see that what happened is we had the side of the mountain coming off first in a landslide, and that uncorked all this magma that was under pressure underground, and that magma exploded outwards in a sideways explosion in a cloud that was full of volcanic rock debris and ash. Now, one of my favorite photographs related to the May 18th, 1980 eruption is the photograph of these two people. They were on the summit of the neighboring volcano Mount Adams the morning of the eruption. And I just love this, standing on the summit, appreciating the day, witnessing the volcano erupting, and you see this person fall to the ground. I think it's hysterical. I can't imagine what it would have been like to view it from that vantage point. What we're going to focus on today is how the habitat or the landscape or the landform for plants and animals to live has changed since the eruption. So I'm going to use some satellite images that were taken as part of a NASA Earth Observatory project. They have this project called World of Change, and one of the pieces that they focus on was the documenting the recovery at Mount St. Helens and the landscape as part of their project. You can see other World of Change projects include mapping and tracking changes in Arctic sea ice and snowpack and temperatures, etc. And it's neat that Mount St. Helens, of course, gets featured here. So I'm going to take us through these satellite images. Now, the first thing that I want to do to orient us to this image is this image was taken before 1984. So that means that there wasn't the technology to change. The satellites couldn't read blue light. And so everywhere that you see red is actually representing green vegetation. So dark red color would be like a dark green mature forest. And we can see here the code of Mount St. Helens at the bottom. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip through this succession of photographs, and I'd like you to just observe, no commentary for me. The date is going to change in the left, and if you have any observations, you are welcome to type them into the chat. 1980, 1985, 1986, 1989, 1995, 2000, 2005, 2008, 2013, 2016, and we're back. Now I'm going to run through those same photographs, but I'm going to add some things that I noticed given my training in Mount St. Helens, living there, etc., and the focus, the zoom in focus on habitat specifically. So looking here, first of all, in 1979, I'm noticing that Mount St. Helens is a cone shape and it is surrounded by a deep forest. There's only one lake, that large Spirit Lake there. And all these boxes that are gray colored are where there is active logging present. So we can see there's a mosaic of land use around the volcano in the year preceding the big eruption. Image number 2, 1980, kaboom, volcano explodes. I am noticing there goes the red. Now we have gray. What is gray? Gray is volcanic rock and debris that exploded out in this big eruption, buried the landscape. You can see just the scale of this. This is a photograph from space, and we can see the impact of the eruption. Let's do it one more time. 1979, 1980. Thank you for indulging me. The next photograph. So here I've highlighted where the blast zone is. It's about 230 square miles, which is a considerable area. Not the largest eruption that has happened in the history of these volcanoes in the Cascades. Kind of a smaller to mid-size eruption, but it was still big for us to experience and for the landscape and the animals and birds. So in 1985, I'm going to point out we now had, instead of just one lake, there were 3 new lakes, one Coldwater Lake, Castle Lake, and then I like to call it Spirit Lake 2.0. How do these lakes form? These lakes are dammed creek drainages where volcanic debris came down through the big eruption, dammed up the creeks, and that formed a lake. The lakes filled up very quickly. Just 5 years later, you can see Coldwater Lake, which is 5 miles long, is almost entirely full. And you might notice there's some gray that's going to move around on the surface of Spirit Lake. These are all logs that were blasted out by the big eruption and then came down and fell onto the surface of the lake. I'm noticing when we move to 1986 that there is now lots more vegetation than there was earlier in 1980, especially on the slopes that were protected from this lateral or sideways blast. So you can imagine the blast starting at the crater at the bottom, blasting out across the landscape. And for the ridges that were protected, not in the direct impact of that blast, the vegetation was able to recover more quickly. And it's subtle on this photograph, but I can notice this lime green color, which is new deciduous trees growing. 1989, areas that were not closest to the mountain, that were not preserved as a national volcanic monument, were again transferred back to the logging companies which owned them before. And so you will notice that those areas get very green very quickly. Weyerhaeuser planted tree farms around Mount St. Helens in the 1980s, and you can see by 1989 kind of the fuzzy green as some of these trees come in. It's mainly noble fir plantations. There's a new road built in the 1990s, Highway 504. That's where I work. At the end of 504, it actually goes a little further now. That built a visitor center. That was the furthest visitor center at the moment, Coldwater Lake, and then it went up to Johnson Ridge after that. 1995, I'm noticing that closer to where the volcano is, we're getting more of the lime green. So there's more new plants growing back. In 1995, I'm also noticing that the shape of the crater is different. There's a new hunk of lava inside. Eruptions happened between 1980 and 1986, as well as between 2004 and 2008. I'm noticing now it's very dark green where the tree farms are. Those trees are really growing fast by 2000. I'm noticing that the green is encroaching closer and closer to the crater of the volcano. We are getting more green. So lime green, again, are those deciduous trees, alder, cottonwood, and primarily the riparian zones. But also there are some early successional trees, so they just come in. And I'm noticing this light green vegetation is now even down in the river valley. Even in the river valley that's very close to the crater of Mount St. Helens, which was completely buried by lots of volcanic debris. And finally, in 2016, I'm noticing that the green is coming in, except the area that is the least green is closest to the crater of the mountain, and that's called the pumice plain. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And I noted here, there's still limited vegetation in this area, and it's mainly restricted to very narrow riparian corridors, very difficult to see from the satellite image on the pumice plain. And so we can see from those photographs, in the way that the vegetation came back, that this sideways eruption of Mount St. Helens contains multiple processes that created different zones, or what are called disturbance zones, in the landscape around the volcano. And we're going to dive deeply into these disturbance zones and think about their effect on birds. But essentially, I just wanted to point this out. We can see this map kind of clearly in the satellite image if you go back now. So this is the schematic where someone drew the boundary of where that blast went and some of the different processes. And if we were to go back to the satellite of 1980, we might be able to see some of those things. We can see the 3 new lakes here. And so that brings us to these distinct habitat zones that were created by the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. And now we're going to zoom in a little bit to these habitat zones and think specifically what makes the diversity of habitats at Mount St. Helens a unique place for you to drive all the way north to come visit for birding. So let's go to this disturbance zone map. This is a very classic map of Mount St. Helens showing the area. And we're going to start with zone number 1, this purple, which is an area that was buried by these pyroclastic flows. This is the area called the Pumice Plain. And the forest that existed here before the eruption was buried by hundreds of feet of volcanic material. No animals or plants survived. We're talking about 600 feet of material closest to the crater of the volcano. And here's a photograph of what a pyroclastic flow looks like. This was taken by Dan Miller from the USGS just a couple months after the big explosive eruption. There were successive pyroclastic flows that came out of the crater. It's when the ash moves according to gravity in a cloud more than going up into the air like people think about or associate with volcanoes. And in the geologic record, this leaves a layer of rock or pumice. And I love this photograph. It's just so classic 1980s, but it's a geologist out on the Pumice Plain holding up this massive boulder like it's a piece of cake, because it is. It's a lightweight volcanic rock full of vesicles or pockets where the gas was, and it's pumice. And you can still see pumice floating in the river at Mount St. Helens, which as the geologist in me is really excited about that. But you can imagine, look at what this person's standing on and think about if you were a bird looking for a place to nest, what would you find here? Many of the bird species that we're excited about, for example, like to nest in habitat along riparian corridors. At least I really like the warblers. I think they're darling. And so if I was a warbler coming through here, I'm not seeing vegetation that would allow me a place to build a nest. Here's a photograph pretty recently of still what it looks like on the Pumice Plain. And this is kind of looking from the north side of the crater of Mount St. Helens south. So you're looking into the crater, like right at the base of the crater. This is one of the creeks that flows out of the crater. And the landscape looks almost like this today. And the way that ecologists describe what happened here in this area closest to Mount St. Helens that was buried by hundreds of feet of this volcanic debris, they say there were no biological legacies. That means that if there was a tree, it was completely buried. And so you didn't get little seeds or a bit of a huckleberry that survived. Everything was completely buried. Even the pocket gophers and things that lived underground, insects, they were all buried by hundreds of feet of material. So everything that came back to this area had to waft in, whether it's a bird coming in and pooping out a seed or an insect like a spider coming in, billowing on silk. And so scientists were really excited when just a couple years after the eruption, they found the very first iconic lupin flower, lupin being an important plant at Mount St. Helens. It adds some nutrients to the soil, and they were surprised at how quickly this happened. And so the scientists scurried around Mount St. Helens. It's in fact the most scientifically studied place in the world, one of them for ecology. And they discovered many different things, including the fact that their assumptions were checked about how quickly life could return. And so here's a photograph of what it looks like today. You can see it's still mainly volcanic debris. If you were to zoom in on the foreground, it's all pieces of volcanic rock. And then there's small bits of vegetation growing in between, but primarily low, like small shrubby plants, like that paintbrush flower that we had in the opening slide. And you can see there's some conifers, some darker green trees coming out, but they're very few and far between, and they're very small. This is what it looks like on the Pumice Plain in Mount St. Helens. And so what does this look like for birds? Well, we have some riparian willow thickets starting to come back and some wildflower meadows. Here's another photograph of what it looks like up there. You can see there's the first layer is moss, and then some of these smaller like lichen and smaller flowering plants. Okay, pictures of plants. Pictures of plants. I always get asked, where are the pictures of the birds? Well, here we go. Here's one picture of a nest of a song sparrow nesting in the willow thickets. This was taken pretty recently. Well, I would say in the last 20 years on the Pumice Plain at Mount St. Helens. And so some of the birds that you can find out here, white-crowned sparrows, really common, dominate. Red-tailed hawks, horned larks, which are primarily in east of the Cascades type species that like open meadow habitat are thriving. It's difficult to walk around without hearing or seeing a horned lark, which I think they're really beautiful and darling to see. Prairie falcons, really common. A colleague who does some of the bird surveying reports that she's never been out on the pumice plain for the time that they are surveying without seeing a prairie falcon. Vox's swifts are common, meadowlark, some of these things that one wouldn't expect or one couldn't find in the dense forest that existed here before. And some owls, which is really fun. So let's go to the next disturbance zone. So we were in this area that was buried by these hot flows of ash that tumbled out of the crater of Mount St. Helens. Now we're going to go back in time and think about that very initial blast of the eruption. This was a similar what's called a pyroclastic, or hot pieces of rocks, pyroclastic density current that blasted out across the landscape, and we saw from the satellite images just how large of an impact it had. And that's colored in the lime green here on this map. So let's zoom in on this blown down forest and see what happens. Here's a photograph looking from Mount St. Helens across Spirit Lake north to Mount Rainier, and you can see there's no more forest here. In a place where there was an old growth forest, there's no forest. It's either buried or blown down, knocked down. And I wrote, this area was blasted by a hot stone wind that wiped out all living animals and plants, in some places buried the landscape. And how much material, closer to the volcano, when that cloud was coming through, it could bury the land with maybe 4 feet or 6 feet or 10 feet of material. And as that cloud dissipated by the edge, it could only deposit, maybe there was only enough particles to cover the ground with maybe 1 inch or 2 of material. So it depends on how close you are to the crater and where that blast cloud came out for what you will find, whether you'll find a forest where the trees are knocked down and actually buried, or whether the trees are knocked down and there's just a thin layer of volcanic material. I work primarily with kids up at Mount St. Helens, and I love this photograph. Everyone's focusing on something. I think it's a piece of poop maybe, but next to them is a snag here of a tree, and growing on this old snag, which is pre-eruption, is a huckleberry. And so this concept of biological legacies, like one plant existing and then other things can come and begin growing on that, is really important. Here's another photograph showing where we have what's called this like blown down forest. And this is really, really important habitat, all these trees. And there's a beautiful swirling pattern to how the trees blew down around Mount St. Helens, and you can hike there today and actually still see it, which is very impressive 40 years later. So trees closest to that, the start of the blast cloud were blown down, and then when the blast ran out of energy, some of the trees were left standing, and this is called the standing dead forest. And so the interplay between pockets where you have trees blown down or dead trees standing is really important in creating a mosaic of habitat for new life. I love this photograph. I took this photograph. Oh, actually I didn't take this photograph. Excuse me. I love this photograph. It is very similar to many photographs of Mount St. Helens, where we have this beautiful diversity of alder and huckleberry and fireweed, all these plants that come in early, as well as some of these older conifer trees, the noble firs, and then these old remnant snags, pre-eruption, old growth forest. So what kind of birds might one find in the blast zone? Well, we have open habitat, shrubs, some standing dead and blown down trees. We have swifts, swallows that come, again, red tails, horned larks, many of the same species that we have in the pumice plain. Meadowlarks are still really common. White-crowned sparrows still really common. And some of our funky owls, like pygmy owls, prairie falcons. The next zone we're going to talk about is the scorched forest, or the standing dead forest. And this is the singe zone. It's hard to see now because some of it's been replanted on the west side, but it's really clear and wonderful if you get to visit the east side. And here's a photograph of what it looked like right after the eruption. You can see this interplay between the trees that were blown down as well as the trees that were left standing. And those trees that were left standing dead, some of them on the very edge of that cloud coming in as the energy dissipated, they were left standing and the needles were singed off of those trees. So that's why it's called the singe zone. And people who witnessed the eruption describe hearing the sound of the burning and kind of crackling needles as that blast cloud came through. Here's a photograph of what it looks like today, full of new growth. The lime greens are some of the maples and deciduous trees, and then the dark blue greens are some of those conifers like the noble firs, and we can see it's this patchwork mosaic forest, and then this habitat of these dead snags. What types of birds are really characteristic or fun to find in the Singe Zone? Well, bluebirds, we have flycatchers, as well as owls that nest in the snags, such as pygmy owls. Finally, the last disturbance zone is the debris avalanche. And this is a fancy name for the landslide that came off of Mount St. Helens. When we saw those photographs again, the side of the mountain came off in the landslide, and then there was the blast. So landslide came before the blast, but the landslide was moving more slowly, so the blast actually overpowered the landslide. And this is where it primarily landed. It hit the ridges north of Mount St. Helens and went west down the Toutle River Valley. Here's a photograph of what the landslide looks like today. I like to describe this landslide if we imagine that photograph of what was actually coming down and out of the mountain. It's all pieces of rocket material. And so when those chunks of lava get, flooded across the landscape, it creates this very characteristic deposit, which is full of lumps and hills called hummocks. So a takeaway, landslides leave distinct geologic deposit of these hummocks. And hummock is a scientific name for hilly terrain. And what's exciting about these hummocks is that where we have the high points, we also have low points. And so in this region around Mount St. Helens, in the landslide deposit, there were over 150 new ponds created. And oh boy, do I love ponds, because that means a lot of riparian habitat and a lot of high diversity of bird species, amphibians, etc. So here's a photograph of one of the ponds in between the hummocks. You can see this is from the trail. There's a trail that goes through the hummocks here. And this is just in June of 2020. Just to impress the point further of how the habitat and landscape changed, here's a photograph taken from almost the same location, Mount St. Helens before on the left. You can see deep dark forest, incised river valleys, and then Mount St. Helens after the 19 eruption on the right. And we can see this lumpy, hummocky, hilly terrain that fills the valley. Here's another photograph of the hummocks deposit. And so I'd like to, this is a photograph of the volcano Mount Shasta, south of Mount St. Helens. And after Mount St. Helens created this hummocky landslide deposit, scientists scurried down over to Shasta and they said, wow, we finally have a way to describe these hills that we saw at Mount Shasta. And I'd like to do a quick poll here. I want to ask you all, so this is a photograph showing what the hummocks look like at Mount Shasta. And the question is, how many times greater was this landslide or debris avalanche at Mount Shasta than the eruption of Mount St. Helens? So again, Mount Shasta had a similar process where the side of the mountain collapsed in a landslide. It created these hummocks and these hummocks in this photograph. I'm telling you that the eruption happened 300,000 years ago instead of 40 years ago. How many more times greater? So we'll launch a second poll here. This is going to be poll number 2. I've been talking for a while, so this is to keep you on your toes. Okay, we'll take just about 30 more seconds with this poll. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to end the poll here and share the results. So can I get confirmation again, verbal confirmation that you can see these results?
Got them.
Okay, great. So let me reveal. So it looks like most people are voting that it was over 20 times larger. And that is very true. It was 22 times larger than the landslide that happened in May 18th, 1980. So you can imagine 22 times, that's an order of magnitude greater. And it left this hummocky deposit. And what's exciting about Mount Shasta is that you can still see, it's hard to see in this photograph, but there are still ponds in between these lumpy hummocks. And that to me is very exciting. Here's a photograph showing how the vegetation has changed on the hummocks. And it's really funny, I actually went to this photo point with the photographer who's contracted by the Forest Service to take the photos every 10 years. And we did the 2021 photograph together, and you cannot see anything because the alder trees have grown so tall. So back in the day, they thought, wow, what a great spot to do a photo point. There's no vegetation here. We can just look out across the river valley. And now it is completely vegetated and the trees are so big. And actually the stake that they put in the ground for where the photo point marker is fell off one of these eroding sides of a hummock, and so it's now just washed away. So it's quite funny how dramatically and quickly the landscape changes, especially when scientists or other people are trying to document the change with, for example, this photo time series. I want to talk for a moment about ecological succession. This is just a fancy way of talking about which plants come in which order, sometimes in a landscape after a disturbance happens. And so I've got some photographs of kids here to make us all feel good because it's fun to be out in the field with kids. But the first thing that comes in are the willows. And these willows provide specific habitat and nesting habitat for many types of birds, as well as specific types of insects on them that many birds then come to eat. So knowing if you are in a willow-dominated area is important and will affect what birds you see. Second, which comes in, are these hardwoods, the alder and cottonwood trees. And you can see along this pond that the pond is ringed by these alders and cottonwoods. And finally, oh, here's another photograph, alders and cottonwoods, great nesting habitat. I think this is from a flicker. And after the alders and cottonwoods come the conifers. And so in the hummocks area of Mount St. Helens, for example, we're still in this transition from willow to alder and cottonwood and almost coming into an alder cottonwood dominated landscape, but we're not quite moving yet to conifer dominated landscape. But depending on where you go in the National Volcanic Monument, you can go to places that were affected slightly differently by the large disturbance of that eruption and kind of work your way through successional time. And so for birding, for us as birders, recognizing the pattern of ecological succession can help us identify the habitats and the particular types of birds we want to see. So let's think about some of the birds that make their homes in the hummocks deposit around Mount St. Helens. We said we have 150 new ponds. It's mainly dominated by these alder cottonwood forests with willows. So we have dippers, we have yellow rumped warblers that come in. We've got waterfowl. We've got many different types of warblers. We've got vireos. And so this diversity of habitat means that we get to see an interesting and eclectic mix of birds in a very concentrated area. So you could drive to one spot at Mount St. Helens and go on a hike and pass through many of these different zones and get to see some of these interesting species, such as gray-crowned rosy finches, which seem to really enjoy the open habitat of the pumice plain, even though it's not in high elevation. They're often seen out there, although I've only seen them on the summit of the volcano. Swainson thrushes make their homes in the blast zone, the blowdown zone. Rock wrens will be in the blowdown zone. Nighthawks, a species that, is much more common in some of the open areas. In this deeply forested habitat, this pocket of disturbance creates a place where nighthawks just totally are abundant. Flycatchers, again, really popular in the Singe zone. Bluebirds as well. And so I wanted to launch this poll here and get us to think about, for all these types of bird species that makes their homes at Mount St. Helens, for the scientists that study and monitor and track these birds, what kind of surveys do you think are currently conducted in the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument? So I will launch this poll. This is poll number 3. And so there's 2 options that I'm listing here. And some of you might have experience doing bird surveys, so you're welcome to type into the chat if you have experience. So a point count survey is when a trained observer records all of the birds seen and heard from a point count station for a set period of time. And then a transect survey is when a transect is set up, which is a transect line, and an observer records every bird seen or heard in relationship to that line, noting how high the bird is, whether on the ground, etc., behavior, and they walk the transect. We're going to take 30 more seconds with this poll. Thanks everyone for participating. So I'm going to share the results here, and everyone is so hopeful that both point count surveys and transect surveys occur at Mount St. Helens in the National Volcanic Monument. I am sad to report that currently there's very limited bird surveying being done at Mount St. Helens, and currently only point count surveys, or sorry, only transect surveys are done right now. And there's a little bit of inconsistent data because the surveys have not been done consistently every year since the onset of the eruption. So there's a push to try to get a better data set by doing them more regularly. The takeaway is that only transect surveys occur presently. And I want to give some context for who the people are who are doing this surveying work and this monitoring, and that is the Pacific Northwest Research Station, which is a research branch of the Forest Service. And they do all sorts of ecological research, including bird surveys, and they favor collecting long-term data. So they're trying to observe long-term trends. And a piece that they published that I really appreciate and I feel offers good perspective about Mount St. Helens is this article, Lessons from a Post-Eruptive Landscape, authored by John Major, who heads the USGS Cascades Volcano Observatory, Charlie Crisafulli, who was until recently retiring the head lead for the Pacific Northwest Research Station for their ecological field studies, and Fred Swanson, also from the USGS, or US Forest Service. And quote, long-term research on the biophysical responses at Mount St. Helens has provided important new insights, challenged long-standing ideas, and provided many societal benefits. And I just want to review a couple of takeaways from this paper. As they write in this, Lessons from a Post-Eruption Landscape, quote, this long-term vantage is important because sustained place-based studies following landscape disturbances are rare. Because the Mount St. Helens eruption spurred the greatest depth and breadth of multidisciplinary studies of biophysical responses to landscape disturbance, and because these responses created some of the most significant societal challenges to emerge after the eruption. And some of what the paper reports on and shows is how some of these very clear habitat changes that have occurred. And this, I love this figure, shows the difference between 1983 and then here in 2014 in vegetation at this one site. And Smith Creek is on the east side of Mount St. Helens. And you can see what has come back. We have a willow in the center of the frame here. You can see those down trees. And then there are some conifers coming back, but it's primarily dominated by the willows. As they write, quote, lessons from long-term ecological research at Mount St. Helens have advanced fundamental understanding of how individual species and biological communities respond to large, intense disturbances. Locally, this work has assisted management of the National Volcanic Monument lands. More broadly, it has allowed ecologists to address the fundamental question in ecology: how do biological communities arise from a seemingly barren landscape? The importance of biological legacies in promoting recovery emerged as an epiphany, one that has informed research at other volcanoes and at sites experience intense wildfires, windstorms, and other forms of disturbance. The work has also prompted fresh perspectives on management of forest landscapes in the US and abroad, such as using variable retention harvesting rather than clear cutting to preserve forest structures and processes. So hooray, ecological research at Mount St. Helens is helping to limit or reduce clear cutting practices or bring a little bit more well-rounded perspective to some of those forest management practices. Very exciting. And I love this paper. It's a summary paper. And for all of us as birders paying attention to the birds, the perspective was bleak in the beginning. In the 80s, when people saw this landscape, there's a lot of work that was published and many photographs and many descriptions from people describing this landscape as just barren and desolate. And the takeaway, I hope for you all, is that our ecology, of course, is resilient, and the ecological renewal of life at Mount St. Helens happened very quickly. And now for us in the present day, it makes birding very exciting because there's this diverse mosaic of habitat types, but nothing is barren and desolate. Every place is just alive with birdsong, especially in the spring. I'm going to do our penultimate poll here. This is poll number 4. There's only 5 polls. Thank you for humoring me on these. And this is, I want to ask us, what important ecological role do the plant species lupin and alder play at Mount St. Helens? We'll watch this poll here. And some of the options are: the plants provide habitat for caterpillars, moths, butterflies, or other insects. Both plant species are some of the first to come back to an area that has been disturbed. Both species add nutrients to the soil through their relationship with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, or all of the above. Okay, I'm going to end this poll and share the results. Well done, everyone. The answer is all of the above. So these two plants play this very important role of providing habitat for the insects that birds like to eat. Some of the first species to come back to the area, so providing a structure for insects and birds to live on, nest in, etc., and then adding nutrients to the soil through their relationship with bacteria and their roots. And this is just a photograph showing some of these points. So these are tent caterpillars on the alder in the hummocks, some of the lupin that's growing around the hummocks deposit, and then a very grainy, I need to take a better photograph, low resolution image of the bacteria which lupin has in relationship in its roots that fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere. So it takes nitrogen in the air and turns it into nutrients in the soil. So by this time, in this section, these past 2 sections, we've talked about some of the distinct habitat zones created by the eruption, and also what makes Mount St. Helens a unique place for birding, which is this fact that we have this mosaic of diverse habitat types, so concentrated together. And I want to take a moment and answer some questions. If anyone has questions, you're welcome to write them in the chat. I see one question in the chat about woodpeckers in the standing dead forest, and yes, there are lots of woodpeckers. I just included some highlights, but I will be sure to add woodpeckers in. Nothing, we don't get black-backed woodpeckers or anything that is specific to that type of disturbance. Black-backed woodpeckers being specific to burned forest, because the trees, there was nothing like charred on them. That wood came off very quickly. So we get lots of sapsuckers and yes, there's downy woodpeckers, of course, in the riparian areas, because there's such a new abundance of riparian areas. We have, one would think, more of those birds. There's not scientific data to support that, but there is more habitat for those types of birds. Any other questions at this point? Anyone is welcome to unmute, raise their hand.
Gina, you said that the alders are nitrogen fixing. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, they are. Many people only associate that, or often associate that, with lupin. And alder also has a nitrogen fixing relationship with nitrogen fixing bacteria. It's not incredibly uncommon. Like lupin is in the pea family, and so that's why many people use pea family plants for cover crops, etc. But alder also does, and that alder, along with that, adding nitrogen to the soil, alder produces just an incredible amount of litter, because it's dropping its leaves every fall, and so that it's the nitrogen that it's taking into its roots, plus then with all its leaves falling down. So it's really tremendous in terms of what it adds to the chemistry, like the nutrient cycling in a place. So as soon as you go from a willow to an alder, the amount of nitrogen that's deposited is just tremendous. It's orders of magnitude difference. Yeah, and one thing that's really important to think about is, okay, so I didn't quite explain this well, but if we think about what the chemistry is of the basic building blocks that make us, for example, our DNA, having nitrogen is very important. It's in many organic compounds like C, H, N, etc. And it forms our amino acids in our body, enzymes, like many things in our bodies are built with nitrogen, and in other animals and birds' bodies, etc., insects. And volcanic debris actually has almost no nitrogen. So this material that buried the landscape is full of magnesium and iron and calcium, but there's not nitrogen. And so the nitrogen really comes from these plants fixing it from the atmosphere. Really great question, thank you. We have another question. Oh, so one person in the chat is asking about public access possibilities. Dick, in the next section, I'm going to review how you can go to these places. So I'll have maps, and we'll go into that in a moment. So I'll hold that question. And then there's one more question about mushrooms. There are mycelial networks. There are chanterelles now that I just foraged in the new 40-year-old forest, which is exciting, more in the conifer forest. There's oyster mushrooms and other things. It's not an incredibly huge diversity of mushrooms yet. But as we're moving from alder dominated to a mixed conifer forest, then we get more diversity. So yes, there are mushrooms. These are wonderful questions. And there's many more questions in the chat. We'll go quickly. I think Sue's asking me what is most surprising about what has happened. I think the biggest surprise to scientists was how quickly they found the first lupin flowering on the pumice plain. Like, especially in the pumice plain, that area where there were not snags of trees that could protect plants behind them, or, catch windblown seeds. The fact that that raw landscape covered in volcanic rock could host a flowering plant was a surprise, how quickly that happened. There are lots of hummingbirds. Okay, everyone, I'm going to add woodpeckers and hummingbird photographs to my birds. Thank you so much. If you have more suggestions of birds to add as visuals in the presentation, please feel free. We get quite a number of hummingbirds. We get the rufous that come in and the Annas. So, and there are Forest Service rangers that live in the National Volcanic Monument that feed the hummingbirds with the hummingbird feeders. So it's quite a lot concentrated around the housing. We'll talk about accessibility and trails in this next section. So I want to thank everyone for those questions. If you have more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Here we go, section number 3. What are the ways that I can visit for birding? And some of you might have been there before. So I want to speak about, okay, the volcano goes kaboom. This was land that was originally given to railroad companies by the US government and then granted to logging companies. And after the eruption, the governments came together, our government, our federal government, and decided to put the land aside as the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument. This monument was established in 1982, and it puts aside the land that is closest and most disturbed by this big eruption. You'll notice it's not the full blast zone that we saw on the satellite map. It's about like between a third and a half of that area. And the mission of the monument was to establish a place for research, recreation, and education. So research being a real primary goal, which is why on the monument you will see there are two different colors. There is the restricted area, which is yellow, and then we have this green area, which is the rest of the monument. And the restricted area specifically restricts access off trail. So for us, if I want to wander around and find the bird in the bush, there are strict rules about going off trail in this area. Some of those rules are being lifted over time, but those rules were created because there are so many ecological studies happening in this small concentrated area that the land management agencies really wanted to restrict dispersed camping, off-trail access, dogs, etc. And so it's really fun for bird watching to be in the restricted zone because we are in a place where there's a lot of rules, and that means that there's often great birding because there's not people's dogs running around off leash, etc. And so I want to review how we can go in to review these unique habitats that were created by the eruption. I want to say that I am including as a post-program follow-up a link to a map that I and my coworkers have annotated at the Mount St. Helens Institute that have pins on the map showing you different places that you can visit and stay, etc. So that should be helpful for you all. So there's three different sides of the mountain in terms of how you can drive up to it by car. So there's the north side, the east side, and the south side. And I'm going to review kind of what trails, hiking access, birding access exist at these three different sides. And here's a screenshot of that map. So again, this will be in the post-trip follow-up email. You'll get a link to this and you can use it and explore. So to get to the north side, all the directions are coming from Portland. So instead of tacking on an extra couple hours, I assume you'll go to Portland, stay with a friend, have a nice meal, and then go up to Mount St. Helens. So from Portland, you go north and then east on the new highway that was built after the volcano erupted, Washington State Route 504. And that takes you to the north side of the mountain. Now, this is only exactly 2 hours drive north of Portland, and the roads are fine. It's straight up the highway and then straight up a brand new wide road that was created after the eruption. So there's great views and birding along the road corridor as well. So there's a wide shoulder. It's really great. And that's where I primarily work. And I put some icons in here. It's like it offers easy, moderate to strenuous hiking, hiking for all abilities. There's guided ranger programs. And it offers access to some of the places like the hummocks, which are world-class, really famous geologic deposits and habitat zones for us as birders. So here's some of those points. Again, brand new road constructed. The road is elevated above the river valley, so you can see raptors as you're driving. It's lovely. And then the visitor centers along the way offer viewpoints. This is a memorial to the people that passed away during the May 18th, 1980 eruption at Johnson Ridge Observatory. And it is the closest you can drive into. This photograph shows a photo, like where you can almost drive to where this photograph was taken, into the heart of the zone on the north side of the volcano erupted. Remember, the volcano erupted sideways, and that sideways explosion went to the north. So you're driving right into the heart of the blast zone. And that's incredible hiking right in the heart of the blast zone. Hummocks Trail with the beautiful mixed new forest. You can go to the Hummocks Trail like every year, every couple of years, and just watch it change. It's a really fun place to be. So here's the Hummocks Trail. I took some screenshots from all trails to highlight some of the key places you might want to see. The South Coldwater Trail is also a lovely one that goes up the ridge that was logged before the eruption. It's got some old equipment up there. Harry's Ridge Trail is like this ridge line right in front of the volcano. You can also see Mount Rainier. And now I'm going to talk about going to the east side, which is a little bit more challenging. So you go east on Washington Route 503, then you hop onto Forest Service Road 90, And then you go on Forest Service Road 25, and then you take the 99 to access the east side of Mount St. Helens. I don't work here all the time. It's longer to get to from Portland. You can also drive north and then head east on State Route 12, south on 25, and west on 99. That will also take you to the east side. The east side, really fantastic views when you get there, but almost no views for the entire drive, and it's a long drive because it's just repurposed logging roads, and the volcano didn't blast in this direction. So you're driving through forest that existed before the eruption. Also, the 99 road, because it's a little bit higher in elevation, closes in November. It's also, it's eroding very rapidly. So it feels less comfortable to drive, let's say in the dark, for example. The hiking there is moderate to strenuous, and there's very limited facilities, including access to emergency services. So you're very far, there's not a visitor center. There are some rangers that drive up there maybe once a week, but it's very remote. There's only pit toilets, etc. And there's one place to get potable water, and if it's not working, then there's not a lot of places to get water. What's exciting about being on the east side, though, is that you have direct access, closest hiking access to get out and onto the pumice plain. And again, this is the area that was most impacted by the 1980 eruption, closest to the crater of the mountain, buried by all of that volcanic debris, kind of the most new landscape. And an exciting place for bird watching, if you care about those open habitat like meadow-loving birds. And there's remote, it's so remote, there's very little traffic. And you also have access to the standing dead forest pictured here, which you cannot access from the north side. It's been replanted by the noble fir monoculture. And some famous sites that are on the east side include Mita Lake, which is this lake. There's beautiful before and after photographs showing how it changed before the eruption. And you can see all the standing dead around this lake, Ryan Lake and others. And from there, you can hike this wide network of trails that takes you all the way around Mount St. Helens. Permits are required for overnight backcountry trips in the Mount Margaret backcountry, which is the backcountry area north of Mount St. Helens. Some highlights on the east side include the Windy Ridge viewpoint. Some of you might be familiar with this spot. It takes a long time to drive there, and there's often a big cloud, but if you get it on a clear day, it is very exciting. Great place for nighthawks, mushrooms, and huckleberries. Harmony Falls is a popular trailhead that will take you down to the shores of Spirit Lake, the lake that existed before the eruption and then was blasted and reformed. I like to call it Spirit Lake 2.0 post-eruption. And then Mita Lake, very famous spot. Mita Lake is one of these alpine lakes that, because the volcano erupted in May, it actually was covered with ice at the time of the eruption. And so the ice insulated the critters underneath, including tadpoles and salamanders and all sorts of amphibians. And so life could return very quickly to places like this because there was that, those biological legacies were preserved under the ice. Norway Pass is a very popular spot, and that will take you into the backcountry. Finally, the other side of Mount St. Helens is the south side. And again, you go north from Portland, and then you hit Washington 503 to the east, and then you go north on 83, and that takes you to the south side of Mount St. Helens. And remember, the volcano erupted sideways to the north, so the south side, it's hard to see evidence for the eruptions. There are similarly limited facilities, pretty strenuous hiking, and limited access to emergency services. But it does offer the trail that leads to the summit of the volcano. The trail, oh, this is me having fun, on the trail that circles all the way around the volcano. You can access it from all sides, but many people access it from the south side. On the Lewitt Trail, you are not allowed to camp in the restricted zone. So when you cross onto the pumice plain, you have to just hike all your way around. It's also pretty challenging trail because there's very little water. So you can see this tiny stream flowing in this photograph here, but essentially the water flows down into the very permeable, both unconsolidated rocks and then permeable volcanic rocks, and it comes out of springs much further downslope. And so you can hike this trail with very little trickles of water. But very incredible way to witness the differences as you encircle the volcano. And from the south side, you can get into a diversity of disturbance zones as well. So here's the trail that leads you to the summit called Climbers Bivouac. Blue Lake is a popular area. There are some really interesting wetlands in the forest back here. Note all of the forest that you visit on the south side has not changed since 1980. Eighth Canyon is another incredible hike. It was great to see when the comet was visible. It was like an east facing spot, so it was really good for that. Okay, we're gonna do our final poll here together. And this poll is asking what places you have visited, if any, around Mount St. Helens, just to get a sense of people's experiences. And so perhaps you've visited north, south, or east sides of the volcano, including some of these popular sites like Johnson Ridge, Windy Ridge, or Ape Cave. Maybe you've hiked all the way around the mountain on the Lewitt Trail, which I have never done. Maybe you have climbed to the summit before or after the eruption. And you're welcome to write in the chat if it was before or after. Of course, you're welcome. Anyone is welcome to write into the chat and contribute any of your experiences in Mount St. Helens. Okay, we'll do just 30 more seconds on this poll here. Thank you everyone for participating. You should be able to see the results here. Looks like 59% of us, 60% of us, 2/3 have visited the north, south, or east sides of the mountain. Just 4 people have climbed to the summit, whether before or after the eruption, and 15 of you all have never been there, and of course cannot wait to visit. So we covered a little bit in that fast flyby of the map, some of the ways and places to go around the National Volcanic Monument for bird watching. I want to conclude by saying that you all are stakeholders and that the role that the Audubon societies and other similar conservation organizations have in the political power and agency in affecting decisions about what happens on public lands is huge, is tremendous. And so when I was speaking with Nina, who does the bird surveys for the Forest Service, she was saying, wow, you're speaking with the Audubon folks. I hope they can help us get more funding to be able to do more research or synthesize some of the data more, because there are still gaps and holes. I don't have any report to share with you all summarizing how bird species and diversity has changed at Mount St. Helens since the big eruption. So I encourage you all to do as you're doing, which is be involved in these organizations like the Audubon Society. And through your involvement, you are affecting change. And I hope that some of you see the change that you're affecting as positive. I see it as positive. Finally, I also want to say that I'm speaking independently of, but I work for the Mount St. Helens Institute. And the Institute is a really neat way to get involved. We offer like trips into the crater, hikes, speaker series, a really fantastic program, training program for adults called Volcano Naturalist Program, and as well as volunteer opportunities, virtual field trips, overnight and family day camps. We have photo contests, and there's many ways to get involved, and it's fun to meet a network of people who are excited about Mount St. Helens. So if you'd like to get out for a guided hike with other naturalists, often our hikes include a geologist on staff or a natural history person. That's the Mount St. Helens Institute. And so I just want to thank everyone so much for your time this evening. I'm happy to take any questions. You're welcome to write questions or comments into the chat. Thank you again for the Lane County Audubon Society for hosting me. It's been really a pleasure to be with you all.
Thank you very much, Gina. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that. You have a good way of describing things. You're definitely an educator. I can tell.
Thank you, Dennis. Okay, so Ron's asking if a bird checklist has been developed. In the follow-up email that we'll send to you, there is a checklist that has not been updated by the Forest Service since, I want to say 1993, which is quite some time ago. There's been a lot of push. Charlie, the big ecologist, just retired, and a lot of people really wanted an updated checklist before he retired. He's still working supervising people in research, but I don't think the birding checklist is going to pop out in the next year or so. We'll see who steps into his role. There's also another website that I share that has a checklist that's not made by the Forest Service, but made by an independent party. So thank you for asking about that. There are plenty of opportunities for people to visit. Like I said, it's just a wonderful place to learn. And in the summer, it rains very infrequently, as you all know, in our climate. And so visiting in the summer where you can see the crater and hike through the landscape a bit and see some of these old downed trees, for example, that are in this photograph is really inspiring. Okay, Ellen in the chat is asking about eBird checklists. I am still a Luddite and I still annotate in my Sibley when I see a bird instead of using eBird checklists. I wish I'm from the younger generation and I should be able to offer you more perspective on the eBird checklists, but your research on eBird is as good as mine. I do most of my learning in person and with a book. There's also no cell phone reception at many of these places, which is fine. You can use these apps without reception, but if you did want to visit and have access to checklists, it's important. There's often no cell phone reception once you leave the highway, the I-5 corridor. So just check in on that before you go. You can get the Forest Service birding checklist for Mount St. Helens for the monument, the National Volcanic Monument, at the visitor centers. Okay, questions in the chat. Donna's asking, how has the snowfall amounts been compared to the past? Can you clarify that question? Are you speaking about just overall in the landscape or specifically? So one thing I didn't speak about, but you can see in this photograph here, is that inside the crater of Mount St. Helens, we have growing both a new lava dome that's exciting. That's kind of the lump in the center of the crater. And then you see there's kind of some snow that snakes around that. There's a new glacier that's growing around the lava dome in the crater. And this glacier is exciting to many people because it's the only growing glacier in the lower 48 states where we live. All of the other glaciers that scientists have been monitoring are receding, but this one is growing, and that's just due to circumstances. Because the mountain happened to blow directly to the north, it means that that glacier is protected by that crater wall on the south side, and so the sun doesn't actually get into melt the snow as dramatically. There's always a shadow there, and so that shadow protects the snow, and when you have snow compacting over time, it turns into glacial ice. What's amazing, and I've talked to scientists, I still don't quite understand, is that we have had lava dome eruptions occurring for many years, most recently between 2004 and 2008. And those are erupting hot rock that was so hot you could see it glowing red from where this photograph was taken, for example. And the glacier didn't melt, it just got squished to the side. So anyways, our glacier at Mount St. Helens right now wraps all the way around the lava dome, and it actually connected a couple of years ago. So now I believe strongly it should be called the Donut Glacier, but it's currently called Crater Glacier by the scientists, which is disappointing to me, tremendously disappointing, but that's okay. Anyways, the glacier is really unique there because of the way that, so it's providing a constant steady stream of water to this valley on a mountain where that was surrounded by glaciers before the eruption, and all of those glaciers, or many of them, had either melted away completely or were dramatically reduced in size. So the new glacier inside the crater is a new water source, and water, riparian habitat, birds. It all links back to where do we get the birds. And so if we have a dry mountain, we're not going to see as much diversity and vibrancy in the ecological communities that are there. Okay, a couple more questions. Donna's asking for overall snowfall in the area. Are we seeing some places with less snow compared to the past? There is a snow tell record at Mount St. Helens, so you can actually go online and look at the data over time. I don't know when that site was set up. It is not necessarily data that's visualized in an easy to read way. I think it's like a raw data table, but you can look up SNOWTEL and TEL, and that will give you some of the records on the snow. Other questions? I'm glad to see someone, Rebecca wrote that she was able to ride in a small plane along the rim of Mount St. Helens in the mid-1980s. That's exciting. We do occasionally have photo contests at the Mount St. Helens Institute. So if you have some old footage that you want to submit to a photo contest, it could end up in something like my own presentation. But I want to thank everyone so much. So again, we spoke about various stakeholders in the land, and the National Volcanic Monument is currently managed by the Forest Service today. They have a really fantastic interpretive program for the interpretive rangers that are there. And then it's also co-managed by the Cowlitz Indian tribe.
Thank you very much, Gina.
Yeah,
That was
thank
really
you.
great.
It was
Really
wonderful.
appreciate it.
Thank you, Gina, everybody.
And I saw that that Debbie is going to put those links on our web page and also on our Facebook page, so people will get that information from you. So thank you again very much.
Yeah, wonderful job and very interesting, great photos. So the whole package, thank you. Thanks for everybody for attending, and we hope to see you next month, and stay safe and dry. So take care. Good job, Gina, thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. And if you do travel up to Mount St. Helens, the Mount St. Helens Institute, where I work presently, is a tiny nonprofit, only 8 people. So you can reach out, and it's easy to find me, and I'm happy to meet you out in the hummocks or wherever. It's always exciting to meet up with some birders. So
Yeah, that sounds great. Really nice offer. We hope to come up soon.